Welcome to the Theological Family Ministry Podcast, a podcast for parents as well as children and youth ministry leaders. We are dedicated to showing how theological study and biblical application relate to the discipleship of children and youth. As always, we're hosted by Pastor Ben Palaz, the pastor of Family and Children's Discipleship at Curtis Baptist Church in Augusta, Georgia, and Tony Trusoni, the family and student pastor at Faith Family Church in Finksburg, Maryland.
Hey Ben, how you doing this afternoon?
Doing well. Struggling to fight through that afternoon fog, but yeah, doing pretty well. How about you?
Doing well. So I had some Chick-fil-A for lunch with some Baptist pastors in the area, which was always nice.
The Christian chicken.
I know, exactly. Baptist pastor meetings have to have chicken. I think it's a law somewhere. So.
And it's preferable if it's fried.
Yeah, you know, it's funny that we tend to record these on Tuesdays, and I have a bit of a more routine schedule than normal, the Tuesdays that we record this. Typically, I do that lunch, and then record these, and then I'll go home at night, and while my wife's meeting with a woman to study the Bible, I sometimes will play video games with her friend's husband. He'll come over, and yeah, we'll play some video games, even though we're both in our 30s. It's weird to admit, but it's true. Do you ever do much of that?
I can't say that I do. I never was a real big gamer, and I really haven't played video games in a handful of years. Every now and then I've got a cousin he's like 19, maybe 20. He'll want to show me something if I see him. But I never played a whole bunch. But at least you're not playing in your mom's basement with your buddy. Mm-hmm. So that's, you're at your own house that you've provided. So
yes. Do you play video games at all then?
I have not played a video game in quite a while.
I remember in seminary sometimes I lived above you guys, and I know sometimes you'd be playing a baseball video game, I believe. Yeah,
I did. I did sometimes. It was like a mind, stress release thing. It's really probably been about 4 years since I've really played much video games. And yeah. Okay. It wasn't an altogether conscious decision. It was just like, kids running around and stuff like that. So I'm not principally opposed to them. I just, it's kind of like movies. I just don't watch a lot.
Yeah, Ben is not your pop culture guy. But
no, hopefully I'm not a Luddite or something like that. But no. That's just things I just don't do. So.
That's okay. So I, in contrast, do play some video games, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today, video games, which might be a surprise, but I think it's important to discuss the impact of video games in our discipleship of our families, as well as how we teach about these kinds of things, even in the church. So, but for me, actually, I do play it for similar reasons to what you were talking about when you played in seminary. It does help me calm my mind. In fact, I've kind of found, I know that I'm not enslaved to them, and I know that me overworking or me stressing out is my own sin struggle. But I think something that can help me naturally to just kind of calm down and check out is especially open world video games. It just helps me to disconnect sometimes when I need to do that. So, but I did grow up. I probably grew up on more video games than you did as well. We were a video game family. I grew up on the Super Nintendo and the Nintendo 64. Did you have either of those?
I had a Nintendo 64. So my parents were divorced, which you knew that. And so at the parent that I did not live with, I got that when I was maybe 12 or 13. And so I only had one friend that lived there in that town, and so I didn't see him all the time. So I did play, play more when I was there. And then I think when I was like 15 or 16, I got a PlayStation 2, which I actually still have. It's not like it had been out for a little bit, but it was still kind of new when it came out, or when I got it. But it was just, it just wasn't a real big part. My dad was not into that really. And I think actually I remember him saying one time that he did not get me something like that because he knew that he would play it and like waste his time, or as he saw it, waste his time. And so anyway, it just wasn't really a thing for us.
Yeah. I do remember I would play some even with my dad, though growing up a little bit different. And I remember growing up, I used to love the... did you ever play the GoldenEye video game growing up? Maybe at a friend's house. It was a Nintendo 64 exclusive, I think.
I did, yeah. I forget, somebody I knew had that game, and so I played it a little bit.
I remember growing up using the Uzi and playing as Odd Job, so fond memories of that growing up.
Dun-dun, dun-dun.
Exactly. So now we talked some about our background and some of our present situation in that. And how has the video game culture changed from our Super Nintendo days or our PlayStation 2 days?
So I think the gaming culture has become more widespread, and it's like a really distinct subculture. You've got a lot more adults playing because, I mean, there were video games around back in the 70s and things like that, but it was pretty basic and you didn't have as much variety, and so it was not the same. And I knew when I was a kid, I knew adults who played video games, but it was more the exception. Now you have people who grew up playing video games who are adults, who spend time and money and all this kind of stuff. And the thing that gets me is with YouTube and this kind of stuff, Twitch and things I don't know anything about. You have people watching videos of other people playing games. It's this voyeuristic kind of thing, and I chuckle when I see kids doing it here at our church. I'm like, you're watching someone else play the game rather than playing the game.
It is weird, isn't it?
So, I guess in some ways it's not that different than watching a sporting event, but I think there are some differences.
I think it's pretty substantially different, but I guess, yeah, that's actually some of the biggest YouTubers are YouTube accounts are people that play video games for a living. It's nuts. So, yeah, I mean, then you get.
I must be in the wrong line of work.
I guess so. Yeah, I agree with you on some of the observations in that. Definitively, more do play than ever, and especially among men. Like us, young men, and even actually most middle-aged men, studies say play video games. Most men that are in the middle-age range, the majority of older men do not play video games. But I mean, the average 45-year-old dad, of teenagers or whatever, plays video games on his own. Statistically, more than half of them do, and in fact, the by far the significant majority of men that are in their 20s and 30s play video games. Some estimates put it as close to about 80% of men that are in their 20s and 30s, which is, again, very different than the culture that we grew up in. So I think we talk about it less, but it's just the case. I think it's also more social than ever, even without local multiplayer. So one thing, my buddy and I play local multiplayer in the same system, and there's not a lot of games for that, like I grew up on, like the GoldenEye grew up on. Most of the time you play online now, but still more people play with other people in video games than ever have. I mean, video games are almost inherently a social thing, and video games that don't try to do that often will fail. But I think it's often much more immersive and open world and open-ended as well. So rather than I pick up a level and I play one level on Sonic and I get done, and then I've got 5 more levels to do at different nights. It's instead, it continue on over and over and over again, and there's no definitive ending. It's just kind of ongoing. There are video games that legitimately have no end whatsoever, and even the ones that do sometimes have 30, 40, 50, 60-hour story times.
Wow, so that's some. I knew about a little bit about some of these things, but I did not realize it was like that. Because in some of those open kind of games, and you'll have to tell me the answer to this, but like was Zelda sort of like an early version of that?
Yes.
Or not?
Yep.
Okay.
Even like the Game Boy one and stuff like that in the first Nintendo one, those are kind of some pre-open. They were relatively open world, not as open world as newer games are, but yeah, they were kind of very similar in that kind of style, though.
Okay. So that's the one I had played just a little bit, and we had seen some people play, so it seemed like that's maybe you were describing. But like that kind of thing just never really was. It didn't appeal to my interest that much. When I played games, I like to play sports games because I enjoyed playing sports a lot, and it just was kind of a natural. I didn't really like shooter games that much, a little bit, but I just kind of gravitated to the sports games. So, and and I do that with a variety of things. I kind of find what I like, and like when I was a kid, I could eat the same lunch every day, and it didn't bother me because that's what. Now, I mean, I'm not a picky eater. I like a wide array of things, but I could eat a ham sandwich, like every day, and so.
No, there's more variety. I'm actually mentioning the length of some of these things. I mean, Zelda was seen as like huge with like sometimes a 10, 15, upwards sometimes of 20-hour storylines. And if you don't play almost any of the side quests, and for example, notoriously large game that came out recently, Red Dead Redemption 2, which by the way, I'm not going to advocate people play, that Forbes said the main storyline alone will take you about 65 hours.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that insane?
That's wow.
Yeah, different world.
And today's episode is brought to you by EA Sports.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
But I think another ironic thing about it is like there's greater levels of realism in this kind of stuff, but at the same time, the ones that are most popular, the big ones, Fortnite, you see especially, or Minecraft, kind of reject that level of realism and are almost nostalgic with the more cartoony animation.
Yeah.
So what are some ways video games teach or inform our worldview?
Well, I think it depends on the genre of the game. It can touch on good and evil and the good life and some of these things and the narratives that are part of that, which that's something, I mean, just you're going to know a whole lot more about. But things that I've heard, and I remember I was at this dinner one time, and this kid, I think he was in middle school at the time, was telling me about some kind of game. Honestly, I couldn't even understand all of what he was saying, but I mean, he was telling me about all these hypotheticals and this and that, and I mean, I was just lost. But it clearly had captured something in his imagination. But I mean, these kind of things that can touch on these really bigger issues. It also, I mean, it can make light of sin or destruction, which we'll probably get into some of that stuff later in the conversation. But it touches on real issues that we face.
Yeah, that's right. So, I think there's some variety of things, and we'll touch more on each one of the ones I'm going to mention. But the first thing I think is important to mention in ways that it teaches worldview is that human value, a sense of worth can be defined by not being a noob, which a noob is a term in video game industry for somebody basically who's inexperienced, that's not very good at a video game. That you don't want to be a noob, or else you can become kind of a social outcast even. But also it can frequently inform misogyny. It can cause a misogyny or sexism. And there's actually been a lot of studies on some young men that have been raised heavily in video games, especially the Grand Theft Auto video games, that come to really disrespect and kind of have an overly sexualized view of women. And I think that's an unfortunate reality of video games sometimes. But also I think it's in general statement. We've talked about movies before. Actually, one of our podcasts that's picked up recently was TFM at the Movies, and we talked about how all movies teach you something. All movies have some kind of narrative, and that narrative has some kind of agenda, some kind of teaching thought behind it. And most video games have stories, have narratives as well. And because of that, most of them are going to have some level of that. An example of the narrative of a video game teaching a worldview sometimes is a popular video game series is called Assassin's Creed. And the Assassin's Creed video game series is often known to have stories that paint a very negative picture of organized religion. And are very skeptical of organized religion. And I think that teaches our kids something while they play it. Is playing video games sinful or even a total waste of time?
I think it could be possibly, depending on the circumstances, but it's not absolutely either one of those.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely not inherently. There's nothing the Bible says about, stay away from video games, heathens. But I do think, it can be, and I think it very often actually even is. I think a great percentage of video game playing, especially among adults, can be neglected.